This is lecture 104 in the ABCs of Communism series. This set of lectures supports volume 7 on communism in Europe. And now it's time for us to move on to the British Isles and the Neolithic Revolution there. I'll make a few introductory comments. During the preceding Mesolithic period, the inhabitants of the British Isles had been hunter-gatherers, as you know. Now, by 6000 BP, migrants began arriving from Central Europe, and these migrants brought the Neolithic Revolution, characterized by plant and animal domestication, with true agriculture and sedentary living. The new order undertook mass deforestation across the islands. Ground and polished stone tools and ceramics are associated in the archaeological remains. These were tribal agriculturalists, but they evolved into simple chiefdoms, and some of them became advanced theocratic chiefdoms. With them, monumental architecture appears of the megalithic type. The earliest megaliths are the chambered tombs. In the late Neolithic, the solar observatory at Stonehenge was constructed, and other stone circles were built. These continued to be built into the Bronze Age and to be used, and these ATC constructions reflect ideological change in preparation for religion and class and state society, evolving from 6300 to 4000 BP. Analysis of the mitochondrial DNA of modern European populations shows that over 80% are descended in the female line from European hunter-gatherers, and in Britain the percentage is 11%. Now, in La Madrugada, to use the Spanish term for the near dawn hours, the late Mesolithic featured Britain's landmass attached to the continent via the Doggerland until 8500 BP. By the Mesolithic, rising global temperatures had replaced the Ice Age tundra with lush forests of birch and pine, retaining the largely nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle of their Paleolithic ancestors. Britain's Mesolithic people left us flint tools and butchered animal bones. Archaeologists have uncovered them at sites like Three Ways Wharf in Uxbridge and along the Old Kent Road. While deer and waterfowl, or wild horse, were part of the Mesolithic diet, they also made plentiful use of fish and waterfowl. The London area has many rivers and other wetlands, although by far the largest is the majestic River Thames, which runs through the heart of the modern city of London and would have been an important resource for prehistoric people. In England's early prehistoric period before the dawn of the Neolithic Revolution, pollen analysis shows that the woodland was decreasing and grassland increasing, with a major decline among elm trees. The winters were 3 degrees colder than at present, but the summers were 2.5 degrees warmer. People in what are now Great Britain, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland were living as broad-spectrum wild resource exploiters. In front of the MI6 building, there is a line of Mesolithic timbers parallel to the shore, the largest of them up to 30 centimeters in diameter. Now, these timbers are exposed at very low tide. Radiocarbon dates these timbers as having been taken from trees around 6500 BP in the late Mesolithic period, when hunting and gathering was still practiced. Now we come to the dawn of tribal agriculture in England, simple and ATC chiefdoms in the early and middle Neolithic. By 7000 BP, Britain began to witness the arrival of Neolithic farming and sedentary life, while continuing Mesolithic cultural practices. A recent study shows that these British Neolithic farmers were genetically related to contemporary populations of the Iberian Peninsula. Then arrival of the Bell-Beaker traders brought genes from the lower Rhine of Europe, so that more than 90% of Britain's Neolithic gene pool reflected this arrival. Anyway, the Neolithic Revolution introduced a more settled way of life, as these people were tribal agriculturalists. They, however, soon moved on to the stage of simple chiefdoms, as they needed strong central leadership, having become divided into professional groups of farmers and artisans. Coming with the influx of tribal agriculturalists was wheat and barley. Forest clearances were undertaken to provide room for cereal cultivation and animal herds. Native cattle and pigs were domesticated, while goats and sheep were imported from the continent. The Neolithic in Britain features the introduction of farming from continental Europe, so as we've seen, European agriculture had come into Europe from two directions, both originally from Southwest Asia. Before this, during the Paleolithic and Mesolithic periods, The inhabitants of the island had been hunter-gatherers, so the transition from a hunter-gatherer society to an agricultural one did not occur all at once. Different agricultural and hunter-gatherer groups within the British Isles met and traded with one another in the early part of the Neolithic, and domesticated animals and plants had to be carried by boat from the continent of Europe to the British Isles. Since the earliest evidence for farming in the British Isles comes from Ireland and the Isle of Man, rather than from southern Britain, therefore the cross-channel jump seems to have been as difficult then as it has been ever since. Switching from a hunter-gatherer to an agricultural lifestyle based on ethnographic studies of farming societies with basic stone tools and crops shows that farming is a much more labor-intensive way of life than that of hunter-gatherers. It would have involved deforesting an area, digging and tilling the soil, storing seeds, and then guarding the growing crops from other animal species before eventually harvesting them. In the case of grains, the crop produced then has to be processed to make it edible, including grinding, milling, and cooking. This involves preparatory work, more of it anyway, than either hunting or gathering. On the other hand, producing food rather than relying on collecting, it assures stability in the food supply. At any rate, these production factors would have propelled people towards simple chiefdom organization for the efficient deployment of resources. The Neolithic agriculturalists deforested areas of woodland in the British Isles, clearing that land for farming, and that forest clearance began around 7000 BP in Broome Heath in East Anglia on the North Yorkshire moors and on Dartmoor. Such clearance was performed with stone axes and by ring barking and burning. In many areas the forest regrew within a few centuries, including at Ballyscullion, Ballygilly, Begmore, and the Somerset levels. Between 6,300 and 5250 BP, millions of elm trees across Britain disappeared. Now this was a direct product of the Neolithization of Britain. Farmers collected elm leaves to use as animal fodder during the winter, and trees died after being debarked by domesticated cattle. Dutch elm disease, found at West Heath Spa in Hampshire, is spread by beetles, and farmers may have used beetles to make more deforested land for farming. During the period from around 5500 to 5300 BP, many of these deforested areas began to see reforestation and mass tree regrowth, and this is another proof of centralized land management characterizing chiefdom society. The Neolithic houses of the British Isles were typically rectangular and made of wood, so none survive to this day. Nevertheless, foundations of such buildings have been found in the archaeological record, although they are rare. And this brings us to the father of the Neolithic Revolution, Professor Vere Gordonchild. V. Gordonchild was born in 1892 and died in 1957. He was an Australian by origin, an archaeologist who specialized in the study of European prehistory. He spent most of his life in the United Kingdom, working as an academic for the University of Edinburgh and then the Institute of Archaeology in London, and wrote 26 books during his career. He was the first exponent of Marxist archaeology in the Western world. Born in Sydney to a middle-class English family, Child studied classics at the University of Sydney before moving to England to study classical archaeology at the University of Oxford. There he embraced the Leninist branch of socialism, campaigning against the First World War, recognizing it as a conflict waged by competing imperialists to the detriment of Europe's working class. Returning to Australia in 1917, he was prevented from working in academia because of his socialism, but he was hired by Labour Party leader John Story as a private secretary. Now, Child soon recognized that the Australian Labour Party was under control of renegade traitors like those of Europe, except for the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party Bolsheviks. Accordingly, he joined the Industrial Workers of the World as the best, at the moment, alternative in Australia. Emigrating to London in 1921, he became librarian of the Royal Anthropological Institute and journeyed across Europe to pursue his research into the continent's prehistory, publishing his findings in academic papers and books. Now, from 1927 to 1946, he worked as the Abercrombie Professor of Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, and then from 1947 to 1957 as the director of the Institute of Archaeology in London. During this period, he oversaw the excavation of archaeological sites in Scotland and Northern Ireland, focusing on the Society of Neolithic Orkney by excavating the settlement of Scarab Brae and the chambered tombs of Maeshowe and Kinnes. Upon being diagnosed with cancer, he wrote his own obituary and returned to Australia's Blue Mountains, where he committed suicide. One of the best known and most widely cited archaeologists of the 20th century, Child is known as the Great Synthesizer for his work integrating regional research with the broad picture of Near Eastern and European prehistory. He was also renowned for his emphasis on the role of revolutionary technological and economic developments in human society, such as the Neolithic Revolution and the Urban Revolution, reflecting the influence of Marxist historical materialist analysis of societal development. He remains widely respected among archaeologists. We have visited Child numerous times in these volumes and now return in Volume 7 on Communism in Europe in this series to his initial archaeological fieldwork at Scarab Brae. The 3-season TV series Shetland, currently streaming on Netflix, is filmed on these islands and has a cinematic presentation of the Scarab Brae site. Now, the road to the ATC stage. Between 5500 and 5300 BP, agricultural villages were located in areas with the most fertile soils. Cases in point abound around the Boyne, Orkney, eastern Scotland, Anglesey, the Upper Thames, Wessex, Essex, Yorkshire, and the river valleys of the Wash. These saw an intensification of agricultural production and larger settlements. The construction of the earliest earthwork sites in Britain began during the early Neolithic, from 6400 BP to 5300 BP, in the form of long barrows used for communal burial and the first causeway enclosure of village sites. The stone-built houses on the Scottish Orkney Islands, such as those of Scarab Brae, proved the Neolithic Revolution had spread through the entire British Isles by 5,180 years ago. Scarab Brae. In the winter of 1850, a severe storm hit Scotland, and in the Bay of Scale stripped the earth from a large irregular knoll known as Scarab Brae. When the storm cleared, local villagers found the outline of a village, consisting of a number of small houses without roofs. William Watt began an amateur excavation of the site, but after 4 houses were uncovered, the work was abandoned in 1868. In 1924, another storm swept away part of one of the houses. To see the site seriously investigated, the town sent for University of Edinburgh professor V. Gordon Childe, who traveled to Scarab Brae in the summer of 1927. Originally built in 5180 BP, radiocarbon now shows that occupation of Scarab Brae continuing for about 600 years. Its inhabitants, after the climate had become much colder and wetter, abandoned the settlement, and that may have been around 4500 BP. However, we know that the original village burial was gradual, and that people seeking a more pleasant locale abandoned it. The Scarab Brae original site was further from the sea than it is today, and it was built adjacent to a freshwater lagoon protected by dunes. Although the visible buildings give an impression of an organic whole, it is certain that an unknown quantity of additional structures had already been lost to sea erosion before the site's rediscovery and subsequent protection by a seawall. Uncovered remains are immediately adjacent to the original village in an area presently covered by fields. Other village locations of uncertain date can be seen eroding from the cliff edge a little to the south of the enclosed area. Scarab Brae's people were makers and users of grooved ware, a distinctive style of pottery that appeared in northern Scotland not long before the establishment of the village. The houses used earth sheltering, being sunk into the ground, pit houses in other words. They were sunk into mounds of pre-existing prehistoric domestic waste known as middens. The midden provided the houses with the stability and acted as insulation against Orkney's harsh winter climate. On average, each house measures 430 square feet in size, with a large square room containing a stone hearth used for heating and cooking. Given the number of homes, About 50 people lived in Shrewsbury at any given time. As for what material was burned in their hearths, Professor Child was sure that their fuel was peat. We know today that other fuels included driftwood, animal dung, and dried seaweed. In Orkney, investigators have found a glassy slag-like material called kelp or cramp that may be residual burnt seaweed. Anyway, the dwellings contain a number of stone tool-built pieces of furniture. These include cupboards, dressers, seats, and storage boxes. Each dwelling was entered through a low doorway that had a stone slab door that could be closed by a bar that slid in bar holes cut in the stone door jambs. A sophisticated drainage system was incorporated into the village design. It included a primitive form of toilet in each dwelling. 7 of the houses have similar furniture with the beds and dresser in the same places in each house. The dresser stands against the wall opposite the door and was the first thing seen by anyone entering the dwelling. Each of these houses had the larger bed on the right side of the doorway and the smaller on the left. Lloyd Lang noted that this pattern accorded with the Hebridean custom where the husband's bed was the larger and the wife's was the smaller. The discovery of beads and paint pots in some of the smaller beds supports this interpretation, as does the recognition that stone boxes lie to the left of most doorways, this forcing a person entering the house to turn to the right-hand or male side of the dwelling. At the front of each bed lie the stumps of stone pillars that may have supported a canopy of fir, and is another link with the recent Hebridean style. One house, called House 8, has no storage boxes or dresser. It was divided into small cubicles. When this house was excavated, fragments of stone, bone, and antler were found. This building was used as a workshop for making simple tools, such as bone needles and flint axes. House 8 is distinctive as a standalone structure, not surrounded by a waste midden. Above ground, it has 6.6-foot thick walls and a porch entrance. The site provided the earliest known record of the human flea, Pulex irritans, in Europe. The grooved-ware people who built Shrewsbury raised cattle and sheep. Child found no evidence of grain agriculture, but excavations in 1972 unearthed barley seed grains from a midden, so we know barley was cultivated. Fish bones and shells are common in the middens, indicating that dwellers ate seafood. And limpet shells are common and may have been fish bait kept in stone boxes in the homes. These boxes were made from thin rock slabs with joints waterproofed and sealed with clay. Now at Somerset Levels, which is a coastal plain and wetland area of central Somerset in southwest England, running south from the Mendip Hills to the Blackdown Hills, there is a wooden road that was built across the marshes there, and that dates to 5807 BP. At this time, leaf-shaped arrowheads, round-based pottery types, and the beginnings of polished axe production are diagnostic. Pottery found in excavation of the wooden road show that domesticated cows were being used for their milk as well as meat and as hauling animals. The Middle Neolithic from 5300 BP to 4900 BP saw the development of cursus monuments close to the earlier barrows and the growth and abandonment of causewayed enclosures, as well as the building of impressed chamber tombs such as the Mayshow types. The earliest stone circles and individual burials also appear. Different pottery types, such as grooved ware, appear during the later Neolithic, 4900 BP to 4200 BP. In addition, new enclosures called henges were built, along with stone rows, and the famous sites of Stonehenge, Avebury, and Silbury Hill, with buildings that reached their peak at this time. Industrial flint mining begins at that time, such as that at Sisbury and Grimes Graves, along with evidence of long-distance trade. Wooden tools and bowls were common, and bowls were constructed. All of this shows us that the simple chiefdoms were advancing toward advanced theocratic chiefdom status. The 2003 discovery of the Ness of Brodgar site has presented an example of a highly sophisticated and possibly religious complex in the British Isles dating from around 5500 BP. The site is still in early stages of excavation, but is expected by investigators there to yield major contributions to knowledge of this period in the not-too-distant future. And that brings us to the early Bronze Age. The Meldon Bridge period is the first phase of the British Neolithic that features metalworking. It spans the period 5000 BP to 4750 BP and is named after the type site of Meldon Bridge in Peeblesshire, Scotland. However, copper was used earlier in Ireland by 4400 BP. Now, metalworking phases are divided into the Stage 1 Castletown Roach Industries from the town of that name in County Cork of the Republic of Ireland, then the Stage 2 called Knockdown Low Ravel Industries. As well as metalworking, numerous other developments appeared in the archaeological record, including hinges, stone circles, Peterborough ware, grooved ware, and cursus monuments. This period can be subdivided into an earlier phase from 4300 to 3200 BP and a later phase 3200 to 2700 BP. Beaker pottery appears in England around 4475 to 4315 BP, along with flat axes and burial practices of inhumation. And that brings us to the subject again, is Bell Beaker traders' arrival. In 4700 BP, a new pottery style arrived in Great Britain. I believe that this marks the arrival of the Bell Beaker traders. Their beaker pottery appears in the Mount Pleasant phase, 4700 to 4000 BP, along with flat axes and their burial practice of inhumation. Intermixed people of this period were responsible for building many prehistoric sites, such as the later phases of Stonehenge, along with Seahenge. This effect of beaker traders is normal in other parts of Europe, indicating to me that the traders brought their own ideological concepts wherever they went, much as traders have always done when accompanied by religionist professionals. Movement of Europeans brought new people to the islands from the continent. Recent tooth enamel isotope research on bodies found in early Bronze Age graves around Stonehenge indicates that at least some of the new arrivals came from the area of modern Switzerland. The beaker culture displayed different behaviors from the earlier Neolithic people, and cultural change was significant. Integration was peaceful, as many of the early henge sites were adopted by the newcomers. Burial of the dead, which until this period had usually been communal, became more individual. In the Neolithic era, a large chambered cairn or long barrow was used to house the dead. The early Bronze Age saw people buried in individual barrows, or sometimes in cists covered with cairns. They were often buried with a beaker alongside the body. The 2017 study showing a major genetic shift in late Neolithic, early Bronze Age Britain, with more than 90% of Britain's Neolithic gene pool replaced by genes of the lower Rhine area, heavily invested with beaker trading people, simply proves the contact. The relative population density of both recipients and interlopers makes the idea that one population had to have replaced the other problematic. It seems to me that the intermarriage of the populations could have easily favored the spread of the incoming gene pool over the latter for a variety of cultural reasons. Now, periodization of Bronze Age Britain features the archaeological remnants as, first of all, from 4500 to 4000 BP, the Mount Pleasant phase. Then from 4100 to 3900 BP appear late beaker knives, tanged sparrowheads in the Bush Barrow Overton period. And finally, from 3800 to 3600 BP, we have the Fargo phase. Now, taking the early Bronze Age from 4150 to 3500 BP, after the construction of the Sarsen Circle and the trilithons at Stonehenge, beaker metallurgical techniques were brought to Britain. At first, the incoming traders made their products from copper, but by 4150 BP, their metalsmiths had discovered how to smelt bronze, which is much harder than copper, by mixing copper with a small amount of tin. With this discovery, the Bronze Age arrived in Britain. Over the next 1,000 years, bronze gradually replaced stone altogether as the main material for tool and weapon making. Britain had large, easily accessible reserves of tin in the modern areas of Cornwall and Devon, and thus tin mining began. By around 3600 BP, the southwest of Britain was experiencing a trade boom as British tin was exported across Europe. Evidence of ports being found in southern Devon at Bantam and Mountbatten. Copper was mined at the Great Orme in North Wales. The Beaker people were also skilled at making ornaments from gold, silver, and copper, and examples of these have been found in graves of the wealthy Wessex culture of central southern Britain. Early Bronze Age Britons buried their dead beneath earth mounds known as barrows, often with the beaker alongside the body. In the late Bronze Age, however, cremation was adopted as a burial practice. Cemeteries of urns containing cremated individuals appear in the archaeological record, with deposition of metal objects such as daggers. People of this period were also largely responsible for building many famous prehistoric sites, such as the later phases of Stonehenge, along with Seahenge. Bronze Age people lived in round houses and used stone rows to divide the landscape as on Dortmoor. They ate cattle, sheep, pigs, and deer, as well as shellfish and birds, and they manufactured salt. The wetlands were a source of wildfowl and reeds. There was ritual deposition of offering in the wetlands and in holes in the ground. Life became complex due to raids along the coast in southern Great Britain by 3200 BP. Bronze Age Britain spans the period from 4500 until 2800 BP, lasting for 1,700 years. The Bronze Age in Britain begins with the use of copper, and that evolved into bronze, enabling the expansion of agriculture. The bronze axe head made by casting was at first similar to its stone predecessors, but then developed a socket for the wood handle to fit into and a small loop or ring to make lashing the two together. Groups of unused axes are often found together, suggesting ritual deposits to some, though many archaeologists believe that elite groups collected bronze items, perhaps restricting their use among the wider population. Bronze swords of a graceful leaf shape, swelling gently from the handle before coming to a tip, have been found in considerable numbers, along with spearheads and arrow points. And that brings us to the chambered tombs of the early and middle Neolithic. Now these are large megalithic tombs, and they've been constructed across the British Isles. Such Neolithic tombs are common across much of Western Europe, from Iberia to Scandinavia, and they were therefore likely brought to the British Isles along with, or roughly concurrent to, the introduction of farming in different parts. Now these megalithic tombs were intentionally made to resemble the long timber houses constructed by Neolithic farming peoples 6800 BP. These tombs, mausoleums, and shrines were centers for ritual activity in the early Neolithic. The success of farming and the veneration of ancestral bones were linked in the popular mind. The chambered tomb at Carrowmore in Ireland dates to 7000 BP. However, most monuments in the British Isles were built between 6000 and 5200 BP, and most of these chambered tombs are those clustered around the Bruna Boyne complex in County Meath of Eastern Ireland, and these include Newgrange, Knowth, and Douth, the former of which was built between 5100 and 4900 BP. The late Neolithic also saw the construction of megalithic stone circles. The stone technology of the British Neolithic differed from that of the Mesolithic and Paleolithic Britain, whereas Mesolithic hunter-gatherer tools were microliths, that is, small sharp shards of flint. Neolithic agriculturalists used larger lithic tools. These included axes made from either flint or hard igneous rock hafted onto wooden handles. Some were used for chopping wood, some axe heads from the period were never used, and some were too fragile to have been used. These latter axes most likely had a decorative or ceremonial function. Neolithic Britons were capable of building a variety of different wooden constructions. For instance, in the then marshlands of the Somerset Levels in southwestern Britain, a mile-long wooden trackway was built in the winter of 5807 BP that connected the Poldon Hills with Wessex Mears. Great Britain had large reserves of tin in the areas of Cornwall and Devon in what is now southwest England, and as we've seen, tin mining therefore began. By around 3600 BP, the southwest of the island was experiencing a trade boom as British tin was exported across all of Europe. Bronze Age Britons were also skilled at making jewelry from gold, as well as occasional objects like the Rilliton cup and the mold cape. Many examples of these have been found in graves of the wealthy Wessex culture of southern Britain, though they are not as frequent as Irish finds. The greatest quantities of bronze objects found in what is now England were discovered in East Cambridgeshire, where more than 6,500 pieces were recovered in Ireland. The earliest known metalworking buildings was found at Sigwells, Somerset, England. Several casting mold fragments were fitted to a Wilburton-type sword held in Somerset County Museum, and they were found in association with cereal grain dated to 3200 BP. Which brings us to the Middle Bronze Age, 3500 to 3000 BP, and three phases of it. 3500 to 3300 BP is the Acton Park phase, characterized by pal staves, socketed spearheads, and copper plus tin and lead. In the phase of Knighton Heath period, 3300 to 3200 BP, rapiers appear. In the phase of the early Urnfield Wilburton Wallington phase, from 3200 to 3000 BP, we have diagnostic tools of urns. Now, in the late Bronze Age, from 3000 to 2700 BP, that's three phases. From 3000 to 2900 BP, the late Urnfield with socketed axes and pal staves made of lead. In 2800 to 2700 BP, the Ewart Park phase and the Linfar phase with leaf-shaped swords, and in Ireland, the final Dowris phase of the late Bronze Age appears to decline in about 2600 BP, with iron metallurgy appearing immediately thereafter at 2550 BP. The Wessex culture is a rich one developed in southern Great Britain at this time. The weather was previously warm and dry, became much wetter. Large livestock farms developed in the lowlands, contributing to economic growth and increased forest clearance. These Neolithic people grew in the cereal grains of wheat and barley, supplemented with wild plant foods such as hazelnuts and grapes. Grapes were consumed in Wessex, as proven by the site of Hambleton Hill. And then we have the Deverell-Rimberry culture that began to emerge in the second half of the Middle Bronze Age from 3400 to 3100 BP, exploiting the winter conditions. Cornwall was a major source of tin at that time for much of Western Europe, and copper was mined at the Great Orme Mine in northern Wales. The ATC stage was extant. And that brings us to Bronze Age London. The population of Bronze Age Britain lived in a settled agricultural society. Their material remains reflect growing social stratification, suggesting that by this point an elite rank dominated society, an elite rank having become a class. Now this is perhaps best reflected in the fact that selected individuals were chosen for interment within round barrows or tumuli, often clustered together in cemeteries. Many of these were built between 2400 and 1500 BC, although unfortunately others have yet to be conclusively dated. Now, the era of modern southeast London saw barrow cemeteries established at various high points. At the time of construction, they would have offered impressive views over both the Thames and the wider landscape, although the forces of urbanization have destroyed most of these barrows. A small number still survive, allowing the visitor a glimpse into the Bronze Age world of their makers. Perhaps the finest is Shrewsbury Barrel, situated on the corner of Bricklow Crescent and Plum Lane in the suburban jungle of Shooter's Hill. This barrow was once one of 6, 3 of which were in a linear alignment. An iron fence surrounds the tumulus, and an information board informs the visitor about the site. Parking is available in neighboring roads, while the barrow is approximately 20 minutes' walk from Woolwich Railway Station. A short drive away is the lone survivor of another barrow group situated just north of Bleak Hill Lane in the eastern part of Winds Common, Plumstead. The Winds Common tumulus is in the middle of an open field and thus is visible from the adjacent roads. On the common signposts, they erroneously labeled it as Roman Barrow. Although the landscape has changed since the Bronze Age, the lack of any housing or trees crowding the barrow offers the visitor the chance to appreciate the site in its wider geographic context. Nearby roads offer spaces for parking, while the site is also accessible following a half-hour walk from Plumstead Railway Station. Pushing further east, intrepid explorers armed with an OS map can find a much-damaged tumulus atop the steep hill in Lane's Abbey Wood. Although less spectacular than the previous 2 barrows, a visit to this barrow can easily incorporate a trip to the picturesque medieval ruins of Lane's Abbey itself. Limited parking is available in Abbey Road and New Road, while the tumulus can be arrived at following a half-hour walk from Abbey Wood Railway Station. And that brings us to the road to MI6. London's oldest structure, now 6,500 years old, lies in front of the MI6 building next to Vauxhall Bridge, which made me think of my visit to London that took up the month of June in 1961. MI6 was housed elsewhere at that time, and its now iconic headquarters would not be completed for another 33 years. My point of departure on that road to MI6 in June of 1961 had still undiscovered Stalin agent Roger Hollis running MI5 and putting on a big show about tailing me. The MI5 Watcher Service had been running tens of thousands of gumshoes against the CPGB, Communist Party of Great Britain, since its founding by Lenin's James Bond, Michael Borodin, in 1920, and now they were watching me 24/7. Hollis had the tactic of throwing suspicion off of him, in case the stumblebums in the CIA station in the Gringo embassy had any, by making a show of cooperation. Anyway, these memories of that summer came back when I was preparing this lecture. At least in London, I did not expect any gunplay, just very close surveillance. And that brings us to a conclusion of these lectures on the Neolithic Revolution in Western Europe. It's time to move on to Europe's slave stage and First Kingdoms, and I will begin that in the next lecture when we discuss the First Kingdoms and their evolution in the Iberian Peninsula.